like this analogy of recipe because when we're talking about work groups and workshops, everybody seems to have their special sauce and everybody seems to have how they go about it and what comes out of it. So today we have 4 panelists here to talk to you a little bit about their experiences and the outcomes that they've garnered from using workshops and work groups in neuroethics and beyond. So we have Dr. Emily Bell as well as Dr. Eric Racine. We have Dr. Charles Weijer and Dr. Michael Burgess.
So thanks a lot. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce the topic a little bit and really leave 3 unresolved issues that I hope that we can work towards resolving today with some of your input about using workshops and work groups. So we've used working groups or workshops in lots of different contexts. Amy Gutman, chair of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, has described deliberation as central to resolving contentious contemporary bioethics issues. But ultimately, there are some unresolved issues about what deliberation or workshops or working groups might look like. So the first unresolved, I think, is uncertainties about the advantages, the limitations, the process of deliberation, and the goals, outcomes, and metrics of these kinds of activities. The boundaries of, what is ultimately a deliberation isn't always clear. There are lots of methods to achieve this kind of deliberation, and we then have to think a little bit about a negotiation between the ends and the means. So is the most important thing the outcome, say the consensus, or is the most important thing to us the process, so how we get there to our outcome? In our eyes, we've used these kinds of workshops as activities that have shared goals. None of them have been consensus building. And instead they've been used to identify where evidence might be lacking, acknowledge different perspectives, and assembling group reflection. We see them as being very collegial, and they capitalize really on the knowledge of experts. These are the workshops we've done have been really expert workshops. One of the challenges is that the outcomes can be very hard to measure or forecast if you're not aiming for consensus. So the second unresolved questions revolve around the nature and contribution of expertise in deliberation. And that's really the question of what's the value of different expertise in guiding policy or practice, and how do we pick what set of expert perspectives is most relevant to be included in any one debate. An additional challenge might be that sometimes we can bring together too many perspectives, especially in interdisciplinary fields, maybe like neuroethics. And that can mean a lack of shared expertise, so we may not be able to even get on the same page. In our experience, we've done workshops with very interdisciplinary groups, and we've done workshops with more specific groups of philosophers, ethicists, and clinical ethicists. And I can say that, again, we found all of them to be successful, but I can definitely see there are some differences in the composition of groups and what the outcomes, how the outcomes arise. Dr. Burgess is going to speak more to the role of publics, and that's another important component of that, is what's the role of the public in debates specifically about neuroscience and society, and is the voice of the expert any more valuable than the voice of the public in these debates? Which also raises questions then about how much does the public need to be taught to engage in that debate, and does that vary depending on what the complexity of the question is? And then the last unresolved, I'll briefly mention, Eric is going to talk much more about that, is really uncertainties about how the goals and outcomes of the deliberations we carry out align with broader theoretical reflections. Is what we're doing, is it even practically related to philosophers, what they intended in terms of deliberative processes, and are different practices in how we vary informed by different schools of thought about deliberation?
So 2 questions are in my mind. First, what is a pragmatic perspective? And what I want to do, just to flesh that out very briefly, is to come back to very basic questions that I think shape our responses to how we view deliberation and how we value or not value it. So first question is, what is ethics? Where do values or ethical approaches come from? What's their foundation, for example? And how can the resources of moral deliberation, but also moral tradition, be engaged in responding to the novel challenges presented by, for example, by neuroscience? This paradigm of moral authority, which answered the following questions in this way. What is ethics? It's a discipline that offers certainty to some extent, and that certainty is based on foundational, abstract ethical principles And if we're using deliberation, it's going to yield a form of consensus or agreement. There's a fallacy underlying what I'm presenting in the following contrast between the paradigm of moral authority and ethical creativity. Ethics here is seen much more as a creative and reflexive process, not necessarily yielding certainty. It's informed by social experience. That's where it's come from, and that's where it leads to. And the resources of moral tradition can be engaged through group deliberation to respond to them. So the idea is to pull from different perspectives to respond to challenges. Within the pragmatic perspective, deliberation plays a key role in the process, basically mediating between the acknowledgement of the existence of a conflict or ethical dilemma and generating a response. And deliberation is this act of creatively coming up with these scenarios and thinking about their outcomes and impact. So in my eyes, and coming from this pragmatic perspective, a key value of workshops is actually to allow for a flow of ideas, to be very creative from an ethics standpoint, and to be more comprehensive in terms of our interdisciplinary ethical analysis. A key pitfall, I think, of these workshops and work groups is to make out of them authoritative statements that curtail reflection and often will not consider the different contexts that need to be taken into consideration.
I wanted to describe an instance of policy making using process to form science policy. There are a lot of different approaches to policy making in science. The bottom line for myself is I think that both substance and process matter. There are facts of the world that we want to get right, and there's also substantive ethical reflection that I think forms irreplaceable foundation for policy formation. Having said that, though, process also matters. You can have the right policy, but if it comes from a process that's broadly perceived to be an unfair one or one that isn't representative, it's not going to be perceived as having authority. So both substance and process matter. The example I'm going to describe is in the context of cluster randomized trial. And the basic difference is these studies involve randomizing groups of people rather than, say, individual patients. So really what I'm describing is going to be an expert panel or an expert workshop that involved deliberation in the sense that it involved reflection, judgment, consideration on the part of those experts and others, but it didn't involve a formal democratic deliberative process. A really important feature of this process was that before we convened our expert panel to draft the guidelines, we did about 4 years worth of work. We did empirical studies where we interviewed leading figures in cluster randomized trials. We did a random sample of 300 published randomized trials and summarized the methodological features and ethical issues that we could find from that. We then surveyed the authors of all of those articles, and we surveyed research ethics committee chairs. So we collected a lot of information about current practice and what also the scientists and the research ethics board members perceived to be the issues. We then distilled a set of core unanswered ethical issues, and we wrote background papers on each of these questions. At the end of this process had questions, and each of them was the focus of a sustained analysis. At the end of that, then we formed our expert committee, comprised 1/3 of members of our research committee who'd done all this work, and 2/3 from other ethicists, trialists, statisticians, research ethics committee chairs, representatives of funding agencies, a regulator, 2 consumer advocates, 2 journal editors, and a couple of representatives of low and middle income country perspectives. We brought together this group. We had a 2.5-day meeting, the first day of which was an open public meeting that we streamed on the web and invited broadly people to participate, and then a closed meeting that led to a draft set of guidelines. We then went back and forth within the group. We then posted the draft guidelines publicly, broadly sought comment on them. Finally, in November of 2012, published the Ottawa Statement on the Ethical Design and Conduct of Cluster Randomized Trials in PLOS Medicine. I think involving leading scientists in this was crucial to the credibility of it. I think the background work really shaped the discussion that happened within the expert panel. People had to respond to the positions that we had developed. And we moved on a number of issues. It was really useful getting the perspective of outsiders on our work, and it really did change a number of the conclusions that we came to. There was stuff, even after 4 years' work, that we just got wrong, and the process of involving outsiders helped us get it right.
I think much of what we do in applied ethics often involves building from one area where we've done work into new areas. And so, let me tell you a little bit about what I do when we engage publics. And when I talk about a deliberation, I want to draw on Patrick Hamlet from Science and Technology Studies to say that what we're really after when we ask people to deliberate is that they first understand a diversity of perspectives in the room. And then in engaging a discussion on a controversial issue, forge a shared perspective on how to live together given the diversity they come to understand through the preparation materials and listening to each other in the room. And I'm most interested in doing that in cases where we have some agreement that we don't have agreement in the expert literature. And you'll see in a moment that we've done a lot of this work in biobanks where reasonable people disagree, and we're never going to resolve the issue of consent to biobanks and things like that. It's a political decision about how we invest for our future and how do we live with those kinds of resources. I'm focusing away from experts, and I want to draw on the political science literature on deliberative democracy, but I want to particularly emphasize in this case that there's a challenge here. We hear a lot in this discussion about scientific literacy, and part of the reason the public doesn't engage in these issues is they don't care. So there's a real challenge in getting people in, but the real point that the political scientists are making is we've got lots of issues we want wide public input on, and we exhaust people very quickly. So what we need are mini-publics. The point here, though, is that we can collect a mini-public that's not the whole public. There represents enough diversity that we can see what a public would decide, a diverse public, were they informed and deliberative and focused on civic-minded conclusions. And the process that we've used here is 2 weekends separated by a weekend. We don't want people making decisions based on the pressure cooker of being here for 2 weekends and having to make a decision in order to get out. We really want this to be situated in people's lives. The point of this discussion, though, is that it's small and large group, it's facilitated, this is not naturally occurring, deliberation doesn't happen naturally. It takes time to skill people up. It's an evolving process. What counts as good deliberation at the beginning doesn't count as good deliberation at the end. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is not only produce policy recommendations and papers, but the policy people, the practitioners, the folks who have the questions and the responsibility, who participate and help inform this and observe, out of the very events end up learning things from the conclusion of the participants that have had effective changes on practices, policies, and governance structures. And so I just try to draw a few conclusions here that come off of some of the suggestions that we want to talk about next, is that the point here is to get informed, civic-minded policy advice. We want people who agree and converge where they can, but the persistent disagreements are really interesting because there you say, okay, you disagree, you're not going to come to agreement. How can you suggest decisions made in your behalf to negotiate those are trustworthy? So what we actually end up getting generated out of them, many of these, is around, based on the persistent disagreement, what are the components of trustworthy governance and decision making? And that's really useful. If we push too quickly to consensus, which professional facilitators often want to do, we miss that real opportunity. We think we must publicize the conclusions coming out of it because we owe it to the people who invested. So those come out, but that's distinct from the analysis of that. So anytime you have a deliberation, there's a group consensus, but we also go back to transcripts. We have people who are observers, and we have other methods of evaluating deliberative quality. But I also want to emphasize that this kind of input doesn't dictate policy. It's one of many legitimate inputs. So the kind of workshops that have been discussed so far can bring experts and stakeholders together for valuable inputs. This is another way of getting some additional inputs, and it influences then, as I said, policy, practice, and governance structures. Thanks.